Bonjour et bienvenue Saint-Javou, bienvenue la famille. So, hello and welcome to St. Genevieve, and welcome to my family. My first question, do you know who I am? Then I must say that Dr. Carl Eckberg in his book Colonial St. Genevieve was correct when he described me as a virtual unknown. In the book he describes me, so most people do not know who I am. Anyway, my name is Francois Leclerc, and I'm the man responsible for thousands of pages of civil documents that you're going to find in the courthouse. I was the scribe, or the secretary, for Francois Valley, the wealthiest and most influential man in Upper Louisiana. So I was a secretary. Tonight, though, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my wife than I am about me. My wife was the niece of Francois Valley. Her name was Marie Louise Valley, and she was born in 1736. I was born in 1749. So to give you a little bit of an idea, she was 13 years older than me. But we got married in February 5th of 1776 in the old town of St. Genevieve, and we lived there, and we had a child in 1778, and we named him Francois. He died a month before his third birthday. We had a second son in 1780. We named him Louis. And then we had a third son in 1782, and we named him Francois again. So we had two sons. Anyway, I passed away in 1789. I was young. I left behind a 7-year-old son and a 5-year-old son, and then my wife, Marie Louise Valley, who I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about. Anyway, when I passed away, I was buried in the old town of St. Genevieve, which is about 3 miles south of here. And in 1789, and my wife, Marie Louise Valley, had noticed that the constant flooding of the old town, it wasn't very good. People were starting to move out, so she had me dug up, moved to here in 1792. Now, in custom with the French, anytime that there's a death, they do a respectful invasion of the home, and they do an estate inventory. I died in 1789, but they did not do our estate inventory until 1792. There was 3 years that had passed. Now, why would that have been? I was a scribe, okay? I was a scribe, so I'm the one who would have been doing the inventory, so they had no one to do the inventory until a few years later. So, you know, my wife was a very smart woman for the time. When I died, there were over 1,400 ons of material in our estate inventory. Does anybody know what an on? It would be like an arm's length of material. There's 1,400 of those, and you stretch them out. She had almost a mile of material, and there were 25 different kinds of material. She also had packages and packages of needles, and she had 15 sets of bed sheets and all kinds of handkerchiefs, and so you got a pretty good idea now what she did, you know. And this was 3 years after I'd passed away. Not only that, but she had 25 billets. In other words, people owing her money for her work. Now I'm gone, you know, she's living on her own. Also, I was smart enough, or maybe she convinced me, but when I did my will, French custom is to divide everything evenly between your wife and your children. So there would be 3 parts. Well, we did it totally different. You know, she got everything except for 1,500 lavors whenever the boys turned 18. They would get 1,500 lavors instead of a third of our estate. And our estate was very valuable. It was valued at over 53,000 lavors, which translated today would be $530,000. So $530,000 in 1790 Sounds like a lot of money. It was. You know, we were very, very wealthy. But this is a question I ask at this point, and somebody will probably know the answer. What was our most valuable asset on the estate inventory?
House?
No.
Land?
No. Our slaves. Our slaves. I remember now. Our slaves made up 40% of the estate. We had 11 slaves listed, and they were valued over 20,000 livres. So again, that was most of our estate. The houses weren't much, and the land wasn't worth much. But you know, we were wealthy. So when I died, she became a veuve Leclerc. A veuve is widow Leclerc. She even wrote her name numerous times as Veuve Leclerc. She was referred to in town as Veuve Leclerc. And she was very wide known. She ended up living until age 87, which she died in 1825, so 199 years ago. And you know, that's kind of why I'm highlighting her instead of myself this year. And our daughter-in-law, who's buried here next to her, she died in 1824. So it's 200 years for her anniversary of her death. This is our son, youngest son, Francois's grave, and then grandchildren, DeCilly, that's her tombstone, and her son is Lieutenant Colonel James Felix St. James. And so we have 4 generations of my family. The Leclercs are buried here. So that's my story, and I want to thank you all and telling you a little bit about my wife, Marie Louise Valley. So thank you.
My name is Genevieve Schwab, and I died during the cholera epidemic of 1854 at the age of 30. At 30 years of age, I was a woman well past my prime. The life expectancy of a woman in Missouri at that time was 39. I was a school teacher here in St. Genevieve, and I never married. If I'd have married, I could no longer teach school. That was the law in the country at that time. I took my boarding with the families who sent the children to the school. The more children you sent to school, the longer I stayed at your house. That was part of my contract. And most of them had a room for me, or a room that I shared with some of the other girls in the household. I always walked to school. Very few people had an extra horse, buggy, or wagon that was just for my use. Cholera was an epidemic that took approximately 1/4 of the town of St. Genevieve across that time period. Cholera was a disease that was transmitted through the water. And many people bringing water into their homes in St. Genevieve were doing so with a bucket. Quite often a bucket they had made themselves out of oak or another hardwood. And I died in July. A bucket full of water, sitting inside in July, everyone using the same dipper or ladle to drink from, was nothing but a growing, festering container full of germs. Cholera took people quickly. It was quite often called the sinking disease because most people succumbed within 3 days. The first symptom you had is you were incredibly thirsty. So what did you do? You drank more water. You also then, by day 2, quite often, had trouble rising your head from the bed. And most people by day 3 were being carried out the door. Now we know that if they'd have boiled the water, it would have taken care of killing the germs. And we also know that there were sections in St. Genevieve and other area towns that the people who stored their water in containers that were less porous, if it was glass or ceramic, they weren't getting as sick or dying. But those containers cost money. Many people were making buckets out of wood by themselves. Approximately, they're guessing that entire blocks in St. Genevieve succumbed to cholera. The household that I was living with, there were 5 people. Within 3 days, the entire household had perished, all of cholera.
Good evening. So I am Marie Villa, and I was born in 1790. I died in 1846. I lived in this town for 56 years. I was baptized in the Catholic Church just over there, November of 1895, at the age of 5. So being Catholic, that was just part of the life in this town. Just about everybody was Catholic. My mother was Marie Louise Valley, and she lived to the age of 51. She died of a lightning strike. My father was Louis de Bril de Villa, and he was a Spanish commandant in the militia here in town. I had 1 brother, 3 sisters, who you just heard from Joseph. My brother Joseph actually married Eleanor St. John Beauvais, and she was the niece of the wealthy merchant Vital St. John Beauvais. I think you'll hear more about him later. My sister Euphrosyne, we like to call her Eugenia. Now, she married John Price. John came here from Kentucky, and he built the Old Brick Tavern, and that became quite a meeting place. It was very popular. My sister Marie Mathilda married Pierre Charles Camille Dehault de la Suze de Louisière. And his brother was Charles Dehault de la Suze de Louisière. And the reason I mention him is he was the last lieutenant governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory from 1799 to 1803, and he actually worked with Lewis and Clark. And then my sister Marcelique married Joseph Herditch. And as you know, yeah, Joseph came to town in 1810, and he was Swiss, an educator. So you know he built the school of the asylum. It was actually built on the river Oxvoss, which was close to our family farm. His teaching methods, the Pestalozzi method, was actually gaining a lot of notoriety. And in 1833, Governor Dunklin appointed him to head up the commission to start the first public school system here in the state of Missouri. But his notoriety took him to even bigger fame and fortune. He became the first warden of the first Masonic Lodge west of the Mississippi, and it was called the Louisiana Number 109, and meetings were held in the Jeannie Ziegler Tavern. Now, I saved my story for last because it's a very sad story. We have a lot to tell you, so I'll make it brief. So in April of 1800, a man came to town by the name of Andrew Henry. He was a well-known explorer and trader, and I was 10 at the time. He took a liking to me almost immediately, and in about 5 years, we declared that we wanted to get married. The problem was, I'm Catholic, he's Protestant. So we had to get marriage bans. In other words, we had to have people testify to our character, to our love, to the kind of people that we really were. It required 20 signatures. So it was a lot to go through. But he did get a Reverend James Maxwell to marry us on December the 16th of 1805. And I was 15 at the time, he was 20. So we were young. But I was harboring a big secret. And I didn't want to tell anybody because we'd gotten everybody to get on board with our marriage. On our wedding night, I declared to him that I had been debauched by my brother-in-law, John Price. And so he was enraged and he left right away, and then he was faced with a bigger problem of trying to get a divorce. Law at the time did allow us to keep our wealth and our estates, but there was no law for divorce in the Upper Louisiana Territory. So he traveled to St. Louis and procured the services of one Judge Otto Schrader. And because of the distance, Judge Schrader gave him what's called a writ of dedimus, meaning that he gave him the ability to develop the law on his own, so he wouldn't have to travel back and forth, but it took 18 months. So it didn't officially get on the books, and we weren't officially divorced until July 4th of 1807, sorry, 1807. So it was the first divorce then in the Upper Louisiana Territory and in the state of Missouri. So it was really groundbreaking, but really, really sad all at the same time. And being Catholic, I could never remarry. I spent the rest of my time with my family, pretty much in shame. Andrew, on the other hand, continued to do business with John Price and with all the people in town, and a few years later he headed west and started the first trading post on the Continental Divide, and at age 38 he married a Mary Fleming, and now you know the rest of the story. Yeah.
My name is Jean Ferdinand Rosier, or as they say here in St. Genevieve today, the English would just simply say Roger. I met my wife here in St. Genevieve, my sweet wife Constance, the mother of my 10 children. And my story is this, that I was a business partner with a man whose name you probably may well know, Jean James Audubon, or as the English say, John James Audubon. Audubon and I were both from Nantes, France, as were our fathers. And our fathers were business associates in Nantes, France, and thought it a good idea for their sons, myself and Jean James Audubon, to try our hand at commerce in this new territory of your United States. We arrived here in 1811, which of course was not long after your Louisiana Purchase, and so our fathers thought there was opportunities here in the New World. Also, were wise enough to think that if we stayed in France at that time, it's quite possible that we would end up in Napoleon's army, we being in our 20s. And so our fathers sent us on our way here, and we had between us duplicate contracts that spelled out the conditions of our partnership. That was drafted in 1806. And it clearly stated that we were equal business partners, 50-50 in all losses, in all profits and all. And it was for us to come to the New World and make do with best we could. Our first stop, though, amongst other things, business-wise, was to stop in Mill Grove, Pennsylvania, where Audubon's father had a farm. And they thought that we needed to check in on that. There was a possibility that there might be some lead on the property that could be mined. But whenever we visited that, we thought, no, the best arrangement is to sell that farm to the person who had managed it, a Mr. DaCosta, for some time. Because he did not like our young whippersnapper presence, right? So we sell the farm and take the profits and use it then to purchase and make our way down the Ohio River on our way here to the new Louisiana Territory. But we checked out opportunities along the way in Louisville, Kentucky, and Henderson, Kentucky. But perhaps one of the wisest things we did with some of that money was to buy 300 barrels of Kentucky whiskey to bring with us as commerce, as trade items, at 25 cents a barrel. And come to discover when we arrive here in St. Genevieve, well, we can say that sell that same product at $2 a gallon. A gallon, I meant to say. 25 cents a gallon we purchase, and so figure that's a 800% profit margin, I think. Not bad. But we did get laid over in the winter of 18 and 10 and 11 at the mouth of the Ohio and Mississippi River, because the river was frozen over and we could not make our way here north. But can you imagine what it was for me to get here in St. Genevieve, and I would have thought Audubon also, being Frenchman, to have spent all this time in the eastern part of your country dealing with your English language, and finally we arrive here and everyone is speaking French. It's like, this is our home. This is where we are comfortable. I was sold. This was the perfect place. No need to go on further to St. Louis. St. Genevieve was opportunities abounded here. There was only essentially 5 mercantile businesses, which is what we began, trading our whiskey and gunpowder and other things, especially to the mining industry, which was taking place just to the west of here. So I was convinced this was the place we needed to set up shop. Audubon, for his part, had left a wife and child in Henderson, Kentucky, and was anxious to get back to them with the hopes of perhaps bringing them up here also. But he soon found out, and this is somewhat ambiguous information, but there appears to be some suggestion that Audubon or someone knew Audubon here in St. Genevieve when we arrived. And Michel Amoureux knew of the fact that his birth was illegitimate. His father had conceived him with a French chambermaid. And when Audubon realized that Amoureux had this information, he thought, not such a good idea to remain here in St. Genevieve as a business partner. So this is the interesting part. Although our contract was for a duration of 9 years, within 6 weeks of us arriving here, Audubon and I are negotiating a sellout of his portion, his 50% of the business, for which I paid him a cash down payment and presented him several promissory notes that he could, once I knew that the business expenses were paid, then I knew what his share was. And so we celebrate the name Audubon here as though he was a native son. You know, we have his name plastered on the city street named Audubon, a senior apartment complex named Audubon Estates. We have Audubon Restaurant just 3 blocks to the east of us here, as though he's part of our heritage, part of our, which of course he is, but not so much as Ferdinand, the name Ferdinand Rozier. And the Rozier name has stayed here through the generations, not going off to draw birds. But this is what happens. This is what comes of drawing birds and becoming famous. Every place that you set foot in claims you as your native son and makes a big deal out of you. So that is essentially my story of how I arrived here. And I'm happy to say that my descendants, my sons and their children carried on the Rozier family name in commerce and trade. And to this day, the name Rozier is still a prominent name in the St. Genevieve community and the 6-county area around St. Genevieve. So if you encounter the name Rozier, very good chance that it is one of my descendants.
Cool.
So my name is John Scott, and I was Missouri's first congressman. I was born in 1782 in Virginia. And then when I was in my teens, our family moved to Vincennes, Indiana. And then I went to school at Princeton and got my law degree there, and then settled in St. Genevieve and opened my law practice in 1806. In 1810, I married my first wife, Catherine, and but then in 1815, 5 years later, cholera was very prevalent at that time, and I lost both my wife, Catherine, and my daughter, Elizabeth, when she was 5 years old, and that's their tombstone. They're both buried there. And so I was a bit of a loner at that point. In 1816, I decided to close up my law practice and instead go into politics. And my first election was pretty contentious and kind of unusual, I guess, that my opponent went to bed election night ahead by 7 votes, but when he got up the next morning, he had lost by 15 because there was a St. Louis County that came in late. And so I won the election by 15 votes, and that was 1816, and I traveled by horseback from St. Genevieve to Washington, D.C. I was known as a very honest man. I delivered packages to people in Washington, D.C., and then brought the money back to people in St. Genevieve. And just so people trusted me. I traveled with my green law bag, and I had a dagger and a pistol that I carried with me as well. I was a fan of duels. I once, there was a magazine or newspaper article printed that wasn't very favorable to me, so I challenged 5 gentlemen to a duel before breakfast one morning. It did not happen because they all 5 backed out. However, I was a second in a duel here in St. Genevieve. Second means that if the first guy doesn't show up, you're the one. And it was between Thomas Crittenden and Dr. Walter Fenwick. And Dr. Walter Fenwick lived in the house down there with the green roof, right at the corner of the cemetery. Well, Dr. Fenwick was a better doctor than he was a marksman, and so he died in the duel. So anyway, as I said, I won the election, and I went to Washington, D.C., but when I got there, my opponent was already there, claiming that the election was stolen or wasn't real. And but I served from August of 1816 until January of 1817, at which time Congress decided that the election was invalid. They declared the Missouri seat empty and sent us both back home for a redo. And in the second election, I won by 400 votes. So it wasn't really close. And I'm sure it had nothing to do with the group of citizens that had a table down the street with free meat and free whiskey underneath the table. But so I had a very successful career in Congress. I was instrumental in drafting the Missouri Compromise, and also leading up to Missouri statehood in 1821. While Missouri was a territory, I was designated the U.S. Attorney for the Missouri Territory. And I won re-election 4 times up until 1824. And in 1824, I backed John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. And most of the state wanted Andrew Jackson. So I became unpopular there a little bit. And so that ended my career, political career. I came back home and established my law practice. And one of the most unusual cases, I guess, was the French have a tradition here on New Year's Eve night called La Guillonnée. And it's where people get dressed up, and they generally go from house to house to house, doing singing and dancing and asking for food and drink. And so it's a good time had by all. But in 1855, the city fathers decided that it was against the law. But this group of Frenchmen decided that they were going to celebrate it anyway. They got arrested, and the city attorney filed suit against them. I was brought in to argue the case for them, and I argued that they acted in a mature manner. Nobody got hurt, and I said that besides that, their right to do that was protected by the Bill of Rights. Well, nobody really challenged me on that, so they came back a not guilty verdict, and the jury and the Frenchmen all went to the tavern and celebrated. So I died in 1861, and at the end of my life, I was asked if I wanted to get religion, and I said, I served the devil all my life. I see no reason to desert him now. So that's my story.
Here all afternoon looking for my brother's headstone, my brother John Dodge. My name is Israel Dodge. Me and my brother were originally from Connecticut. We served in a Revolutionary War there, the Battle of Brandywine. I was injured in the chest with a bayonet, and my brother John, he stayed with me all day and night until I got better. He kept me in the Army as well, made a career man out of me. After the Revolutionary War, he was made the Indian agent of the Illinois Territory, and he was moved here to Kaskaskia. My wife and I, we followed, not knowing what else to do, and so I served under him in his authority. And my wife and I, we made our lives as farmers, and we fended off the brutal Indians that lived in the territory. Shortly after my brother's death, we moved here into St. Genevieve, and in 1804 I was elected sheriff. But sadly, 2 years later, I died at the age of 46. My brother was 40 when he died. My wife, I'm not sure what happened to her. I'm not even sure if she's buried here.
So your brother was buried here?
My brother was buried here, but I'm not. His grave is unmarked.
Are you buried here?
I'm buried here.
Oh.
My grave is also unmarked.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the many people that were, reside in the cemetery with unmarked graves.
Good evening. Let me introduce myself. My name is Robbins, Prospect K. Robbins. Everybody calls me PK. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1788. Growing up, I heard of this westward expansion, this wilderness west, and it always intrigued me. So in 1810, I moved to a village of St. Charles, just west of St. Louis on the Missouri River. I worked as a school teacher. I taught surveying. I was actually elected county surveyor for St. Charles. In May of 1813, I enlisted in Callaway's Company of Rangers. In June of 1815, I was discharged. I'd reached the rank of first lieutenant. A few weeks after my discharge, I received a letter from a gentleman by the name of William Rector, who was the deputy surveyor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, and he requested a meeting. A few days later, I left for St. Louis, met up with Mr. Rector at his office. There I also met a gentleman by the name of Joseph C. Brown. Mr. Brown and Mr. Rector had done quite a bit of survey work over in Illinois. Mr. Rector explained that there was some survey work that he needed to have done. It seemed like the United States had bought 890,000 square miles from France for $15 million, and they needed some survey work done. It seemed like they needed to sell this property. To sell the property, they had to describe it. They needed it surveyed. He went on to explain that my line was going to be a north-south line. We would require our equipment and our supplies. The equipment was a compass. Again, it was to keep me running north and south. We would require a chain. We were to measure that line. This is a chain. We would gather our supplies, our crew. That fall, we were supposed to meet in St. Louis on the bank of the Mississippi River. And we did. We hopped on a boat, headed south. We stopped off at the St. Francis River. Mr. Brown got out and made camp. I floated on down to the Arkansas River and made camp. The next day, we headed north. The compass was to keep us running north. We'd measure the line. After approximately 56 miles, we intersected Mr. Brown's line, his west line. That intersection, that point, is described as the initial point of the fifth principal meridian. All the deeds in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and half of South Dakota, all is based on that point. We were going to set up a grid system. The United States wanted to survey everything off in square miles. So when we left the initial point, we were measuring 40 chains, half mile, set a post, mark witness trees. 40 chains, we had gone a mile, set a post, mark witness trees. Every 40 chains, we were setting up that mile square system. Other surveyors were going to be coming in behind us and expanding that out. After 356 miles and a few chains, we reached the bank of the Missouri River. Our job was complete. Went on back to St. Charles, gathered up all the notes, organized everything, went back in, met up with Mr. Rector in St. Louis, turned everything over to him. We were done. I went back to St. Charles, married my high school sweetheart, Elizabeth Evans. We had 2 children, Jesse and Joseph. In 1830, we moved down here to St. Genevieve. Joseph was the county coroner for a few years. He ended up moving back up to St. Charles. Jesse was, he was an attorney, circuit clerk and recorder for quite a few years. He was also a state rep. In May of 1847, my wife always wanted me to be baptized, so I was baptized. In June of 1847, I died. I'm buried somewhere here in the cemetery. Now, in real life, I'm a surveyor. I've been the county surveyor for 28 years, and I belong to the County Surveyors Association. In 2010, the cemetery was going through a renovation, so the county surveyors donated this bench in memory of P.K. Robbins, and there's a plaque there, and it shows the outline of Arkansas, Missouri, and it shows the fifth principal meridian on it. Now, Mr. Brown, his line was very short, you could see, compared to PK's. But Mr. Brown went on, he had an illustrious surveying career. He surveyed the northwest and south boundary of Missouri.
Trey Beyond, very good.
Welcome to my family.
Anyway, Beyond Vanille, Mesdames, Monseuse. Je m'appelle Martin Aubuchon. My name is Martin Aubuchon, and I'm here tonight. I'm not talking as a spirit. My distant grandfather, Antoine, his original grave has been in more in the old cemetery in the original town, which is down by the river. But needless to say, although I do have relatives in here, the Carones is a very common name here, so I'm related to them. And the Valets are distant cousins also. Anyway, so tonight I'm not talking as a spirit, but as a descendant of Antoine Aubuchon. Antoine was one of the seven families that appears on the 1752 census in Saint John. So it is an very old French name. Aubuchons were farmers. And we're like the Smith and Jones of Mississippi Valley, by the way. But anyway, and then one of the third Antoine, and they went westward and found another settlement here west called French Village. And French Village is another little small village. There's a cemetery there, a lot of French people in St. Anne's Parish. And French Village originally was a small village, served as kind of a stopping point for the lead ore, because they would stop. There was an old plank road from St. Genevieve, and they would travel that on their way over to Bricky's Landing, which is a river port in Mississippi. So French Village was kind of a stopping point. But anyway, needless to say, that's enough of the Aubuchons. But I am going to talk about a trial that did occur here in St. Genevieve. It actually ended up being a French civilian trial, and because of the situation, there was also a military investigation. Okay, this is 1777. What government controlled this area? It is a French town, but what government were we under? What authority were we under? Any guesses? Anybody remember their history?
We've had the revolution, so 1777.
Well, this would mean before the revolution or during the revolution, but there was a world event before the American Revolution.
Spanish American?
Spain, yes, because after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, France lost, and they ceded the area east of the Mississippi to England, and then the area west of the Mississippi to Spain. So at the time of this incident, we were under Spanish government. So consequently, there was a Spanish lieutenant here that we had a small Spanish contingent here in town. The other people involved is Mary Ann, an Indian slave, Widow Aubuchon, which is my distant grandmother, who had ownership of Mary Ann, the lieutenant of the government, and the key player, Celadon. All right, now I'll tell you about the trial. Celadon was a Métis hunter, mixed blood. He was mixed blood. And he'd come into town, he'd rented a room, and getting supplies, and while he was here, he struck up a friendship with Lieutenant Villers. Lieutenant Villers sold tafia. It's like a mixed watered down rum out of his quarters. He was also making friends with Mary Ann, and we know from testimony later he basically was trying to court her or take her, wanting her to go back into the frontier with him. And then of course Widow Aubuchon, who had Marianne. So this is all going in town. They're all making friendships. One evening, they decide, some of the townspeople over across the river is Fort Deschartres. So they decide to go over there one evening because there's a party going. They go over and socialize. While there, Celadon strikes up a conversation with an Indian lady. Name we do know, we just call her Indian lady. So apparently he must have been persuasive for something, because one evening he goes across the river and then convinces her for her to leave with him, and then they camped south of here around Saline Creek. There was a camp there. So something happened that something we don't exactly details, but there is. Anyway, I'll get to the final verdict later. So anyway, so he somehow must have, snuck across the river, came back, and they camped there. Something happened that evening. One morning, the hunters are out searching, and they find a shallow grave, and it's the Indian lady, and she had been shot, and she'd been shot in the upper chest. They come back into town, notified Commandant Francois Vallée of the situation. He sends out a search party, or a posse looking for Celadon, because he's a potential candidate, a potential suspect. He also notifies the Spanish government because of the relationship between Celadon and Lieutenant Villars. The people were nervous because there's a potential murderer around. So they're trying to find Celadon. The Spanish government comes in. Lieutenant Villars is assigned as part of the military investigation. So they're conducting this investigation. They bring in Marianne. They had questioned her, going through question things at her, and for some reason they put her in chains. They put her in ankle chains. And up to this time, the slaves had free reign here. She was one of the people that went across the river over to Fort Deschartres. So anyway, that may have had a bearing on her decision later. So anyway, they're investigating. They're asking people. They're asking hunters who knew Celadon. They all testify one thing. They said he had a hair trigger rifle. So keep that factor. So they're still conducting an investigation. They're asking different people. Celadon sneaks into town, goes to the house of Widow Aubuchon, finds Marianne in her quarters, and he convinces her to leave with him. One of the things about the conversation was she wanted to leave with her oldest son Louis, but leave her younger son behind. And Louis said, "I will not leave my little brother." So they leave. Celadon and Marianne, they leave town. Widow Aubuchon doesn't report the incident until like 3 days later. So that just shows you the talk about how slave-master relationship here. The final verdict was based on testimony from the hunters, was that it was an accident, which is very plausible, because why would you go across the river, go to the trouble of getting a soulmate, come back, and then you're going to shoot her? So a lot of, and that's a final verdict. And they do know that Celadon, when he left town, he went over to the Black River, and they had a camp over there. and hunters then would stop by and visit, and then of course they'd bring stories back. And one of the things they said about Mary Ann was that she'd always ask about her sons, were they being treated well, and then were they getting a good Christian education, because apparently she was very, very religious. And we know all these facts, testimony from Mary Ann, the lieutenant, Mary Ann's two sons, because they all exist in two records, the civilian records, which are up at St. Genevieve, and then the military records were found over in Seville, Spain. And thanks to Carl Eckberg, a noted author and Illinois University professor emeritus, he found all this information and wrote it and documented it in his book called Sealing the So anyway, this is an incident. It's not a spirit, it's not a spirit story, but it is a story that happened here in St. Genevieve, and then it is a connection with my grandmother. So.
Thank you.
Pierre Charles Dehault Delassus de Louzière. A simple name, right? I was born an aristocrat in Bouchain, France, which is in northern France, really close to the town of Lille. And my father was the mayor of the town, my grandfather was the mayor of the town, my great-grandfather was the mayor of the town, and I was the mayor of the town. And so I was born in 1738, and in 1765 I met a 20-year-old lady, a girl, beautiful girl. Her name was Domitille Joseph Dumas, and she married me for my name, Dehault Delassus de Louzière. I married her for her money, because I needed money. So we started having children. We had eventually 5 children. Pierre was the oldest. He was quickly followed the next year by Jacques, who ended up later in life not taking the name Delassus de Louzière, but Saint Vrain, and I have descendants here that are called Saint Vrain now. The third was Charles. The fourth was my daughter, with the apple of my eye. Her name was Jean Félicité. And then my last son, his name was Philippe, and we ended up calling him Camille, and that's where he went by the rest of his life. Well, I started rising in the ranks. I became a treasurer of the whole district. I eventually became a commissioner in the Royal Navy and a counselor to King Louis. So we went to France, and we went to parties, and we were in parades, and we had a great time. And then in 1789, something happened in Paris. It was the French Revolution. And with a name like mine, I was probably destined for the guillotine. So I decided we're moving to America. So there was a real estate agent in Paris, and he said, I've got some land for you. 2,000 acres in Gallipolis, Ohio. I said, I'll take it. So I put my family on a ship, along with 10 servants, a harp, millstones, and a big painting of a parade in Paris. And we sailed to America on a ship was called the Citizens of Paris. What a terrible name for a royalist ship. So we got to Philadelphia, and the captain said, you can't get off the ship. You brought too many things with you, so you owe me more money. So I had to pay him more money. Then I find out that when I get to Gallipolis, that it was a land swindle. There was no title to the land. So I ended up going and buying land in Pittsburgh, building a house, about 3,300 acres. And in a couple of years, I found out that the governor of Louisiana was an old friend of mine, Baron de Carondelet. And so I went down there with a couple of other guys, and we said, Baron, if you let me have some land, I will build flour mills and sawmills and have bakeries to make biscuits for the army. And his buddy said, okay. So he came up here, and he gave him a small tract of land from about 2 miles south of St. Genevieve down to almost Chester, Illinois now, called Beaubrulé. And I became a captain of the militia and commandant of the district or the post of New Bourbon. And I gave out land grants, and I built this big house up on the hill overlooking the big field. And unfortunately, all of my plans failed. It just didn't work. I did build a mill down in New Madrid, but the river came up and ruined the mill. Couldn't get more millstones that worked here. They weren't like the French ones. And so I got in debt. luckily, my son, Charles, had been in the Spanish Army, and he had been named the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Louisiana in St. Louis. And he was up there when they lowered the Spanish flag on March 10th, 9th. And then March 10th, they raised the French flag, and then they took down the French flag and put up the American flag. So we are now American. My son, he's still with the Army, so he heads south to New Orleans. I, on the other hand, with Domoti, we stay here. And my wife became despondent. She had been used to Paris and the parties. And Moses Austin, the father of Stephen Austin, came to St. Genevieve. And he went and talked to my wife and I, and Domoti was despondent. She did not like living here on the frontier. And she pointed at that painting that they had brought from France. She said, I was there the day of that parade. And so in 1806, in the middle of the year, she died and is buried here in the cemetery. In December of that year, I died, and I'm buried in the cemetery here, but I don't have a tombstone. This is a friend of mine. I was over here talking about the old days when you guys showed up. And so we don't know where our final resting place is. The town of New Bourbon is still here. It's not a town, it's like 4 houses now. It used to have 150 people. There's a town 35 miles west of here called Delaware on the other side of Farmington. And there's a book about me that Dr. Eckberg wrote called A French Aristocrat in the American West. So this is the story of a true Frenchman who came to the frontier, his dreams unfulfilled, and died here.
Had a fun life, though. Welcome. Would you like to hear about me and my husband? Yes, please. Okay, I am Elizabeth Lynn. I am from St. Genevieve. I was actually born in Kentucky. My family ended up over in Washington County, which is the next county over from here. My brother was a doctor and a politician. He and my parents are both buried over there. Do y'all know the area? Washington County? Okay. If you're ever in a little area called Caledonia, my parents and my brother are buried there. I, of course, stayed here with my husband. We got married about 1818, 3 years before Missouri became a state. My husband was a doctor, and I raised our kids, plus I supported him in his work. I loved him dearly, as did everybody else, and I believe everybody really loved him. So he was a doctor. He would go out, make house calls. He was extremely intelligent. When cholera became a thing, it actually started over in Europe. He was contacting those doctors. He was finding out what are the symptoms, what are the medications, what's working, what's not working. So then when it got here, he could actually deal with it a lot better. He was all about the people. There's a story about him where one time the steamboat was coming down the river, and they literally stopped and threw this guy off because he had cholera. Somebody came to our door and said, we've got somebody down at the river, he has cholera. I understand if you don't go get him, because it was a deadly disease. We understand if you don't want to, but he really does need help. Of course, my husband said, oh, absolutely, and he went down to get him. While he was down there picking up this person, all the town people came to our door, and they're like, he's not bringing him back here. He's not bringing that disease here. And I could actually see they had gone a little bit crazy. I could see it in their eyes. So I sent one of our workers down to tell my husband so he would be aware. Well, he comes back with the person, the town people disband, and we were able to bring the person into our home and care for him. That is how much my husband loved people. So when he was approached 10 years after being a doctor by the state of Missouri that said, we just lost a senator, they died, we need somebody to come be a senator for this area. And he says, no, thank you. I like being a doctor. You know, in politics then, very similar to now, you had, you know, two sides of, you know, everybody had their position except for him. He did have a political party, but he really was for the people. They all loved him. Everybody in Washington City, which is what Washington, D.C. was called at the time, loved him. When he passed away, I had letters sent to me from President Van Buren, President Buchanan. I was very in the know of a lot of the political individuals. Those are just a couple. but every letter I got just said how wonderful my husband was and how caring he was. He was really huge during his lifetime on getting the United States to buy the Oregon Territory. So he worked diligently to make that happen, but he died before it happened. It did eventually happen. President Buchanan is the one that actually signed the documents. So we did eventually buy the Oregon Territory, and he is given credit for that happening. We had 3 children. We had a 9-year-old daughter who passed away. We had a son and a daughter who lived to adulthood. Our son, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, just passed away. He was living up in St. Louis. He was to be buried down here, right here in this area, and but the way they were transported was on the river. The river was frozen. So they were going to bring him down after the river thawed. That never happened. If you're from St. Louis, you might be familiar with Bellefontaine Cemetery. He's buried there. He never made it here. I lived until 1861. I moved to Virginia and lived with my daughter. Of course, you know, that was the Civil War time was beginning. But I left before that. She arranged to have me sent over here and have me buried here as well so I could be next to my husband, which of course I am ever so grateful for. I thank you for listening to me. I hope you're enjoying the spirits, and make sure you come back again next year.
Thank you. Wrote a book about his experiences when he lived west of St. Louis for a while. When he went back to Germany, he wrote this book describing the rolling hills and the waterways being just delightful, that it would remind you of the homeland. Not too different from where they came from, but at better economic opportunity. So many people came over looking for that better life over here. I came over with my parents as a teenager. My husband came over because his uncle paid his way. His uncle was kind of a Marlin Perkins of the era back then. He was a naturalist, and he was promoting the natural life, plants and animals, and he had a zoologist friend who had been over here and said, ooh, there's a place south of St. Louis where there's a saline creek that's just perfect. And he ended up here. Now together we had 11 children. 4 of my little ones are buried in this cemetery, and I don't know exactly where anymore because their wooden crosses have rotted away. You know, at one time this whole cemetery was covered in wooden crosses that are gone now. I had a total of 11 kids. Some of my sons were big businessmen in town. Do you see that red roof over there? One of my sons was a tinsmith. He put those tin roofs on the old buildings in town. Anyway, I lived to be 90 years old, so by that time this cemetery was closed, and I'm buried across town in the new cemetery. There are quite a few Germans in this back corner.
Good evening, folks. My name is Nicholas. I was born in France just outside of Paris in 1733, and then as a young man I studied under a master carpenter, and I learned how to make cabinets and dressers and tables and such. When I was about 20 years old, I was hungry for adventure, and everybody in Europe was talking about the New World. You got to go to the New World for whatever it be. So I board a ship and I come to New Orleans, and there I say, meh, I like adventure, so I joined the French army. During that time, this is the 1750s by the way, the French and Indian War is happening, so I served 2 years, I fight in the French and Indian War. After that, I pick up some really bad habits, but there's a catch, I'm really good at them. One is drinking.
How are you good at drinking?
Well, I don't know. 2 is gambling. I'm really good at winning. I get this nickname, La Chance, which means lucky. So I take my original last name, which is Caillou. I'm Nicholas Caillou, or Caillot if you can't pronounce that in French. And I decided to change it to La Chance. So now I am Nicholas La Chance. I grow tired of New Orleans and the gambling and stuff. I want to settle down finally. So I hear there's some land up the Mississippi River. So I go up and I come to a place called Kaskaskia Island, which is about 7 miles south of where we're standing today here in St. Genevieve, and I meet this wonderful young lady.
You're putting so much pressure on me to be lovely. My name is Mary Ann Lachance. My parents are French Canadians. They were from Canada and they moved down to Kaskaskia, which is where I was born. And I met you when I was about 15.
And I was 24, I think.
That's right. And we had a short courtship. There honestly weren't too many men on the island at the time, which, by the way, back then was technically Virginia. It was part of the Virginia territory.
And the fact that there wasn't many men there on the island, her dad really stuck it to me with the dowry. He really made her expensive to marry. See, back then we had to pay the lady's father the privilege to marry his daughter.
But now it's called Illinois, isn't it?
Yeah, now it's Illinois.
Isn't that strange? That's what the modern people dress funny. That's what they've been telling me. But we got married just about a year later when I was 16 and you were 24. We had 11 kids together.
So, like I said, I'm pretty good at gambling. I've made quite a bit of money. And I'm also a master carpenter. So I use my influence. I become the lieutenant over there of the militia due to my experience of serving in the French army during the French and Indian War some odd years earlier. And I'm also the local church warden and the local magistrate judge. So, well, there's more actually.
You're just bragging now.
I tend to do that, unfortunately. I have good meaning behind it.
But there's one thing I wish you could do.
I'm getting to it.
I wish you could make buckets. Our house has been flooded out 5 times in Kaskaskia.
Yes, it has. We are constantly getting flooded out in Kaskaskia. But there's this other thing that I do like to do, and it's usually after dark. I like to smuggle furs and liquor and ammunition. And
you don't like paying taxes.
I don't like paying taxes, and who does? Nobody. So one night I'm out doing that, and I come across this group of men that are in blue coats with red facings on them, and who's it end up being? General George Rogers Clark and his Virginia Continentals. The year 1778, by the way. The American Revolution has been ongoing for a few years, so they are out here to capture land before the British can, because after the French and Indian War, all this territory went to the British from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. So we did not want the British getting a hold of the Mississippi River and then coming eastward. So the General George Rogers Clark come out here to make sure that did not happen. I then accompany him and his men all the way to Vincennes, Indiana, and then up to Fort Detroit on another campaign. It takes me about 2 years to get back here. Year 1780, I finally return home. She is not happy, and
your husband goes missing for 2 years. Are you going to be happy?
No, and neither are the locals, because now they're saying that 60 men from St. Genevieve just went up to St. Louis because there's word that 1,000 Indians and British are coming down to Mississippi. So I gather my stuff up over in not Illinois, but in Kaskaskia, and George Rogers Clark and his men are ready to go, and my militia men are ready to go, and we go up there and we fight the British on the other side of the river. So on the eastern side is Cahokia, on the western side is St. Louis. In St. Louis, where there's this giant arch thing today, stood Fort San Carlos in 1780. It was a partially built Spanish fort because it was a Spanish territory on the western side of the Mississippi after the French and Indian War. After the battle, I return back home. I don't see battle anymore, other than what my wife wants to fight me on.
What were you doing for 2 years?
Every now and
200
then.
years later, he still hasn't told me.
Let it go! Anyways, we finally get flooded out for good this time. It took the whole house. So it's 1787. It's gone. I said, all right, that's it. We're taking what we have left, which is why you want me to build buckets, I guess, because we had to bail out water. So
we don't have enough buckets.
The house is not saleable. We take our 11 children, our 14 servants, and we cash in on our 300 farm acres, and we bring what we had up here to St. Genevieve because it is higher land, and we live here for about 12 years, or I do. I passed away in 1799, and you passed away, unfortunately, before me in 1795.
I cook with a lot of butter, but
Yes.
the 11 kids probably did it too.
Yes.
Yeah. And our 11 kids ended up moving to what's now called Fredericktown,
Yep.
in what's now called Madison County.
Yep.
But at the time it was called St. Genevieve County until the early 1800s when it got split up. St. Genevieve used to be a massive county. It got split into multiple counties.
And you might ask, well, Nicholas, didn't you die when you were about 62 and Marie when you were 54? Well, why are you so young? Well, we want to come back in our prime, so this is why we look like this tonight.
This is about when I met you, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is when I was the happiest.
Give or take a few years.
This is when I was the happiest before our house got flooded
Yeah, well,
5 times.
you're on child number 5 at this point, probably?
But you know what's ironic? We moved from Kaskaskia up here to avoid the flooding, and our graves got flooded out. We don't know where our tombstone is because it's since flooded away.
They've been lost to time, unfortunately.
But I know that we're buried here. I remember it.
We are buried here.
So until then, I'll just float around. come back in 200 years, I'll still be here.
As will I.
My name is Louis Felix Vallet, and this is my mother, Odile Vallet. I was born right here in 1823 in December.
1811.
Have you been down to see our house?
Which
The name is Felix Vallet House. It's a stone building just up the street. Papa was involved in business with his father and brother. It's called Menard and Vallet, big trading company. And downstairs in our house, the store was on one side, and of course our part was on the other side. And if you go in, you can see my bedroom upstairs. It's still there, cleaner than it used to be, much cleaner. But that's my room. I think you should go see it.
we will.
I was very lucky as a young child, of course, because the Vallet family, my grandfather, my great-grandfather were all involved in the government and business and trading, land, all sorts of things that made our family really pretty wealthy. And I have to say, Papa had a lot of influence in St. Genevieve, too. So, as a young child, you didn't understand that exactly, except you just knew that your house was nicer than everybody else's. So I felt real lucky. I was the only child, though, so I had a lot of other playmates who were my cousins, because in St. Genevieve, when I was just growing up, everybody around you was your cousin. Even if they weren't your cousin, you called them cousin. I grew up and had a good life here, but you know, when you get into your 20s, you want to look for some kind of adventure, something more exciting than your hometown, a little boring. What were you all doing in 1849?
And so he wrote about.
I think I was still working on the farm.
You were in the farm? Well, that's not too exciting, but you read the papers, I'm sure. In 49, you remember what the big news was for us in 49? Out at Sutter's Mill, my gosh, the whole world exploded out there. They discovered gold, remember, in California. And so there were several young men, all my cousins from right here. We all decided that was where we were going to go, and that was where we were going to make our fortune. So we all ended up out there in California, and we went to a place called Indian Springs, Indian Diggins, the Mud Flats. Those were all the places we ended up in Calaveras County, out in California. So I was out there by 1850 because they signed up my name on the census. So that's where I was, and we were all drawn by the stories of finding gold, just picking it up off the ground. So we thought that was what we wanted to do. Not quite the truth, obviously. When we got there, we discovered things were a lot rougher and tougher. It's a pretty hard existence out there. But you know, every once in a while, you might find a little bit of gold. And so that was so exciting. He thought, now I'm on the edge of getting rich. I'm going to find gold. I'm going to find gold. It didn't work out. It didn't work out that way. The Boshi boys went out with the idea of making money in business. And they did pretty well at different times. But it was not the life you imagined. It was pretty rough and tumble and kind of rough living out there. So it was several years, you know, we kept trying and trying and trying. My cousins wrote back home and were concerned about me. They thought I needed to get back home, back to my parents here. And so they thought that somebody should send for me and bring me back home. But I didn't do that. However, by 1856, my father had sent for me, and he ended up sending me to Philadelphia. And I went to the hospital there because I was not very well. And I was in the hospital in 1856 in Philadelphia. He hired the best doctor he could find, Dr. Kirkbride, to try and take care of me, get me better. But it didn't work very well. And I died in the summer of 1857. So no family there with me. I was all by myself. No wife, no kids. And of course, when I passed away, I left my mama and papa all by themselves too. So it's kind of a sad thing for us.
Yeah.
But that adventure of the gold rush really drew us out.
Who are you looking for?
And I was buried in Philadelphia for a bit, and then reburied here in August of that summer. Right here.
I did 89, so sometimes I am a little slow with these types of things. My husband and I had a very, very successful mercantile business. Have you been in my house? I hear that they let anybody in my house nowadays, and it's located right down the street. We had a very good life. We were very wealthy. And as you know, my son was born at the end of the year after we were married. We were married at the beginning of the year in 1823, and our son Felix was born at the end of that year. So unfortunately, he passed away at 32 years old, leaving us with no heirs or no children. However, we were able to give back a lot to our community, to our church, and thus the story I'm about to tell you. So my dear Felix passed away in 1877, and that is my husband. I don't know if you're familiar with the cemetery's history, but they stopped interring individuals in 1880. You look at my gravestone, I passed away in 1894. However, once this cemetery was full, we donated land for the new cemetery, as well as a few years prior to that, I donated some money to the church itself, close to $18,000. I hear of something called inflation. So in today's world, that would be close to $853,000. That is a lot of money. So they didn't fight too hard when I was asked to be buried here in the cemetery next to my dear Felix. So we are very proud and very happy we were able to give back to the community. It's fun now to hear that our name is on so many things here in St. Genevieve, and that so many souls have had the opportunity to enjoy our church as much as we did.
Absolutely, and that's so they didn't get confused with it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Bonsoir. I play the character Marie-Reine Julie Barbeau-Genie. I was born across the river in the little village of Prairie de Rocher, we would say now, or the French would have said Prairie de Rocher. I was born across the river in 1764. Does anyone know what that date would be significant for? The year that St. Louis was founded. So I was born in Prairie de Rocher at the time that St. Louis was founded. And I was born into the Barbeau family. Our father was the commandant for Prairie de Rocher and also the captain of the militia. So I tell people that's kind of like being the mayor of the town and the chief of police rolled up into one, because it would be very similar to that. And I had 5 sisters and 1 brother. Our brother was, of course, named after our father. He was Jean-Baptiste Barbeau-Fils, which is sort of the French way of saying junior. And then I had 5 sisters. We lived in Prairie de Rocher, and Prairie de Rocher was kind of a gathering place, so there were many balls that were held and families would get together. I met my husband-to-be at a social event in Prairie de Rocher, and with our family's blessing, we started to court, and after about a year, we got married. I was 17, he was 22. We moved from Prairie de Rocher to Kaskaskia and had very quick succession. We had 4 children, and we moved here to St. Genevieve, moved into the Green Tree Tavern with my in-laws, and had 5 more children while we lived here in St. Genevieve. So we had 9 children altogether. I unfortunately died at the relatively young age of 52, and my husband fortunately had good health and he lived to the age of 78, so he raised our family. At the time that I died, my youngest child was only 5 years old. I died when I was 52, and in comparison to that generation, to the next generation, in looking at the research of birth dates and death dates of our 9 children, 4 of them lived into their 80s and 90s. So that's pretty good, you know, from me passing at the age of 52 and then the next generation having more longevity. And an interesting thing happened in your common era now. A singer known as Melissa Etheridge went on the TV show Who Do You Think You Are? And they researched her genealogy, and it came right back here to St. Genevieve. So my father-in-law, Nicholas Janis, Janis, built the Green Tree Tavern, and Melissa Etheridge traced her ancestry to the Janis family and to the Green Tree Tavern. And so that makes me, or my character, the 5 times great-grandmother of the singer that you know is Melissa Etheridge. So I just think that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Any questions or?
The Green Tree Tavern?
Yes, yes.
Still here?
So it is still here.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
So Melissa Etheridge was able to tour her ancestral home, which is kind of cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's still
one
here,
of
and you
the-
can see it too. The National Park Service owns it now.
Okay.
They do tours at selected times. You could find out more at the Welcome Center.
Very cool.
Yes. Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. Thanks for coming.
Come on over. So, did you just come from my Uncle Francois up the hill there? Okay, wonderful. So he probably told you a bit about our family, that you're in the Janis part of the cemetery. But my name is Marie-Jeannette Janis, and I was born in 1787 over in Prairie de Rocher, Illinois, across the river. Americans say we call it Prairie de Rocher, in case you're wondering. And I was one of 6 siblings, and I was the daughter of Jean-Baptiste and Marie-Reine Julie Balbo. And growing up, we had a very happy household, and we always heard of the stories of my father's time in the Revolutionary War. Stories of great heroism and bravery, and it entertained my siblings and I for hours. And we also heard a lot about my grandfather, Nicholas Janis, who was a prominent settler in Kaskaskia, Illinois, and even got to receive William Clark of Lewis and Clark Explorer fame when he was coming through town to service him with goods and things that he needed. So I grew up with this legacy of great, adventurous, heroic men, and so when it came time for me to hope for a husband, I hoped for someone in that same legacy. And I found a man straight from France named Pierre Daguet. He came from Rennes, a small village up in northwest France, and I was amazed at his stories of crossing the ocean and eventually getting to St. Genevieve, where we met and married on July 26, 1808. This was the happiest day of my life. I wore a white dress in the similar Regency style that I'm wearing today, and I was convinced, as my mother and my sisters helped me to get ready, that I was the pinnacle of elegance and beauty and modesty, and it was just the beginning of a very happy chapter for Pierre and I. It was a really exciting time to be in St. Genevieve. In the early 1800s, we were at the peak of our culture and our trade. We were still primarily a French settled area, but still had some German and Spanish settlers as well. And then many of the goods of the area, like lead, fur, salt, agricultural goods, were being dispersed through the Mississippi River to the entire Louisiana territory. And then the distinctive French colonial architectural style was going up at a rapid rate with its vertical logs, the Norman truss, the unique construction methods. So I was convinced I was in the center of the universe with all of this excitement happening at St. Gen when I was in my prime. And St. Genevieve proved to be a great place to raise a family as well. Pierre and I were blessed with 2 daughters, Marie-Eloise and Reine Sophie. And Marie-Eloise would grow to an old age with a family of her own, while Reine Sophie would not live beyond her teenage years. I had a very happy life as a simple one and a happy one, as a wife and a mother and a member of this community. And I preceded my husband in death at the age of 36. We were married at 20, so we still had 16 years, but I preceded him on October 17th, 1824, just about 200 years and a week that I've been over on this side. So that is the story of Marie Jeannette. And on a present day level, my name's Laura, and I'm really excited to share the story of Marie Jeannette because I just discovered in the last couple months in preparing for this night that Marie Jeannette is an ancestor of mine. She is my 3 times over great-grandmother. So it's just really cool to be able to share the story of someone that you're related to, that it was kind of a surprise for me. So
it's amazing.
It is amazing, yeah.
So cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and for listening.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Wow.